The 6-3 Supreme Court decision that struck down Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is not the end goal. That's just the start. The latest Supreme Court decision gutting the Voting Rights Act is not just some isolated legal opinion. It's one page in a very long chapter. And we're going to dig deep into that in the rest of this conversation. And I'm going to show how that decision follows a long line of decisions that guts individual power, guts voting power, emboldens businesses and the wealthy elite, all for the purpose of returning us back to the rules and regulations of the First Republic. So stick around as we dig deep into this. And if you haven't already done so, make sure you drop me a subscribe. So when we think about the decision that just passed, it's just one page in a long chapter of the history of this country. And the chapter that's being written right now is all about dragging the country backwards. And it's dragging the country backwards to fulfill and satisfy the vision of rich, wealthy, white elites that are using organizations like the Federalist Society, ALEC, and the Heritage Foundation to bring us back to a time before the Civil War where only white men ruled, and they ruled with impunity, and everyone else was seen as property. The goal for this regime and the Republican Party is to take us completely backwards, before Reconstruction, before the Civil War amendments, back to the First Republic. And that's a society that's built for white men, property, and power. And everybody else needs to know their place or face the consequences. The Republican narrative tells you that they're about small government, individual liberty, personal responsibility. That's the mythology that they sell you. That's the mythology that they sell you that allows you to buy into an ideology that is completely working against your interests. And I know this from a personal perspective because I was conservatively aligned as an independent in my 20s and 30s. I consistently voted for Republican ideological positions, but I had a libertarian streak to myself. I wanted the government to stay out of my life and leave people alone. And for far too long, I ignored what their actual policy positions meant in terms of the day-to-day lives of everyday citizens. And what their policy goals and positions meant was that every aspect of your life was going to be monitored and controlled through the lens of a white Christian nationalist ethno-state. That's the goal that they wanted to return to. So all of that talk, all of that mythology about individual liberty, limited government, personal responsibility, that's just a Trojan horse. And it's a Trojan horse designed to lull people into a false sense of security so that the Republican Party and the conservative movement is empowered to restore the old hierarchy. And they've done this through manipulating the courts, corporate power. They've done it through voter suppression. They've done it through culture wars, the weaponization of race. Republicans have been working to rebuild the pre-Civil War order with modern tools. So here's the thing that we need to understand. When people talk about the First Republic, and if you want a deep dive understanding of what the First Republic is about, you need to check out Tad Sturmer, and I'll tag him in the show notes so you can get his content. He's a historian, and he talks all about what the grand vision is for the Republican Party, and more specifically, what the original intent and who the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence was really designed for. It wasn't designed for everyday average Americans, and it certainly wasn't designed for brown and black people. It was designed to empower and entrench the liberties and the rights of the elite, wealthy, white males of that era. So when we talk about the First Republic, it's wrapped in parchment and powdered wigs. You talk about founders and liberty and limited government, but the question that you need to ask is, who is it limited for? Because when you look at the pre-Civil War Constitution, it didn't guarantee equal protection. It didn't protect the right to vote. It didn't ban racial discrimination. It was a document built on the premise that some people have all the rights in the world and everyone else is just property. We, the people, really meant the elite, rich, white men of this country. And the entire intent of the Declaration of Independence and the original Constitution was designed to protect white men, wealthy white men, and their property. And when we talk about property, let's not forget that property of that era included people. That's the system that the Civil War amendments were designed to break. And let's keep in mind, the wealthy elites of that era fought against those things tooth and nail. The 13th Amendment ended slavery, except as punishment for a crime. And that loophole, as we see today, is what gives us the prison industrial complex. The 14th Amendment promised birthright citizenship and equal protection under the law. Guess what's under attack today across all the courts in the U.S.? The 15th Amendment said the right to vote could not be denied because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Guess what they're trying to do today? That was the new republic, the second founding. And this was the country saying, at least on paper, that the slaveholder republic was dead. But here's the thing. Even though America was built on the backs and blood and bones of black people, and even though America was built on the blood, sweat, and tears and enslavement of those people, and even when that was quote-unquote abolished, America never accepted responsibility and never accepted accountability. And the old order that lost the Civil War, they were never properly punished and held accountable for the things that they did. And they never accepted defeat. And if you really want to understand that, all you need to do is look at how the Civil War narrative is framed across all of the school curriculum in the South. That entire lost cause narrative, the entire war of Northern aggression, anything and everything that was pushed forward by the daughters of the Confederacy tells you exactly why we are where we are today. It's because the Confederates, the traitors to the Union, never paid the price. I've said it before and I'll say it again. If America really wanted to deal with accountability, the entire South should have been burnt to a cinder. But instead, America made the decision that white comfort was more important than accountability. And that tendency to err on the side of white comfort has happened for a century and a half, and that's exactly why we're here today. Now that we've set the stage, you should have an understanding of how today's Republican Party was built on the foundation that I talked about and that was established in the First Republic. You have a better understanding of what Republicans mean when they say they want to make America great again and return to an era where America was good. But that's just the beginning of the story. In part 2 of this conversation, I'm going to talk through how the lessons from the Confederacy and Operation Paperclip all led to the creation of the Powell memo. And the Powell memo is the foundation for everything that we see today. That single document establishes the rules of engagement that the Republican Party has been using since the Nixon administration. So check that out in part 2. If you haven't already done so, make sure you subscribe to this channel and then tune in for part 2. Now that we've set the stage, you should have an understanding of how today's Republican Party was built on the foundation that I talked about and that was established in the First Republic. You have a better understanding of what Republicans mean when they say they want to make America great again and return to an era where America was good. But that's just the beginning of the story. In part 2 of this conversation, I'm going to talk through how the lessons from the Confederacy and Operation Paperclip all led to the creation of the Powell memo. And the Powell memo is the foundation for everything that we see today. That single document establishes the rules of engagement that the Republican Party has been using since the Nixon administration. If you haven't already done so, make sure you subscribe to this channel. In part 1 of this conversation, I went over how the Calais decision that gutted the Voting Rights Act wasn't something that happened out of the blue. In fact, it was one page in a long chapter in a massive book about how conservatives in the U.S. have been consistently against civil rights for anybody that isn't a rich white male. If you haven't checked out part 1, make sure you do that. And in this conversation, we're actually going to talk through about how one single document, the Powell memo, set the stage and offered the playbook for the Republican Party to completely take over massive segments of the society so that they could push forward their vision of what it took to make America great again. Because you see, conservatives throughout the history of the U.S. were the old order. They were the elites. And many thought that at the end of the Civil War, they were defeated. But here's the thing. That old order never accepted defeat. It went underground. It went into the courts. It went into the state legislatures. It went into corporate boardrooms. It went into think tanks. It went into law schools. And the great-grandchildren of that old order are occupying the Supreme Court today. They're completely entrenched within today's Republican Party. And they either hold gavels or wear robes, but they all push forward this idea that we need to return back to originalist principles and pretend that those originalist principles, those principles that said that most humans are property, that's what we need to return to, and that's what neutral looks like. We're going to be covering a lot of ground in this conversation. Make sure you drop me a subscribe so that way you don't miss any of the new episodes that come out. When we look at the 250-year arc of U.S. history, the fact that the traitors of the Confederacy were never punished for what they did and never held accountable for their actions is one of the biggest contributing factors to why we're here today. When you look at those decisions, America has followed this pattern of behavior where people that need to be punished severely never received their just desserts. Think about what happened in the immediate aftermath of World War II. What did the U.S. decide to do with all of the high-ranking Nazis that were now finding themselves in a situation where they had lost the war? Rather than ruthlessly punish those people and execute the vast majority of them, what did the U.S. do? The U.S. signed away any risk of retribution and brought them inside our shores, and those people began the infiltration of all sorts of different agencies and organizations within the country. We made the decision that rather than holding these people accountable for their decisions, it made more sense for us to assimilate them into our society and give them a free pass. There's certainly an argument to be made that what happened in 1930s and 1940s Germany is the direct outcome of the U.S. not punishing the Confederacy. And the argument can also be made that what you see in today's Republican Party, up and down their right-wing media ecosystem, and throughout their legislative ecosystem, and throughout their governing worldview, that wouldn't have been formed to the extent that it is today if the 1930s and 40s era Nazis that we welcomed here. If we want to take a look at how we got here, we need to understand a couple of things. The U.S. has consistently demonstrated an unwillingness to punish people appropriately for their treason. It happened with the Confederacy. The U.S. decided that white comfort was more important than accountability. It happened again in the aftermath of World War II, where the U.S. welcomed with open arms all sorts of high-ranking Nazi officials as part of Operation Paperclip. You can take a look at both of those things and draw a straight line to where we are today. But in between those time periods, we need to look at key people that were put into place and the ideas that they pushed forward and how those helped frame the situation that we are in today. And one of the key architects of how we got here is Lewis Powell. Because if you want to understand how we got here, you have to understand the modern Republican project wasn't built by accident. It was built and planned by Lewis Powell, and it was accelerated by Richard Nixon. In 1971, before he joined the Supreme Court, Lewis Powell wrote a confidential memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And before we dig into the details of it, if you haven't already done so, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Drop me a comment on what you found the most interesting so far. So what was that 1971 memo about? The title of the memo was called The Attack on the American Free Enterprise System. And the memo reads like a panic attack from the corporate ruling class. Let's understand who Lewis Powell is. Now, he's often described as a moderate Democrat of that era. But make no mistake about it, Lewis Powell was no friend of the civil rights movement. In fact, when you look at some of his writings that have been uncovered recently, what you start to discover is that this is a wildly racist justice who has a vested interest in keeping an all-white ruling class. So that is the frame of reference that you need to apply when you're thinking about the Powell memo. So he looked around the country in the early 70s and saw the civil rights movement, consumer protection, environmental rules, labor power, anti-war organizing, and students questioning authority, and saw all of that and came to the conclusion that this was an attack on business. He stated that business interests in the U.S. were under attack. And that language matters, because once you define acts of democracy as an attack, you give yourself permission to do whatever you want to do to repel that attack. Let's keep in mind that language of attack and enemies is used by the Republican Party and has been used by the Republican Party for the last 50 years. What Powell did is that he identified universities, media, churches, intellectuals, artists, and politicians all as sources of criticism against the business interests in the U.S. So what's the TLDR of what he's saying? The TLDR of what he's saying is know your place and shut up. He did not like the fact that people of all races, creeds, and colors were speaking truth to power. That was the attack on the U.S. That was the attack on business. Students were talking too much. Workers were talking too much. Black people were talking too much. Consumers were talking too much. Everybody who wasn't already sitting in a boardroom getting a voice was a problem for Powell. And furthermore, corporate America, which propped up that architecture, which propped up that foundation that allowed for mediocre white men to prosper and everybody else to suffer, corporate America hated that too. So Powell gave them a plan. He said businesses need organization and they need long-range planning. And you need to be consistent over the years. You need large-scale financing and you need united political action. What Powell was handing them wasn't a memo. It was a battle plan. And the target was not just the left. The target was any institution that could teach ordinary people to question concentrated wealth. So every one of those entities that he mentioned, that was a target. So now that you know the details of the Powell memo, we all understand how this is the foundation that everything going forward in terms of the Republican Party was built upon. What Powell did was give Republicans the playbook that they could use to execute and consolidate power for themselves and their rich benefactors. In the next part of this conversation, you're going to see how the memo was just a starting point. And in fact, the contents of that memo were left largely hidden as Powell was nominated to the Supreme Court. And that set the stage for everything that we see today. Powell's appointment to the Supreme Court would lead to catastrophic consequences for the average American. And that's what we're going to cover in part 3 of the conversation. So if you haven't checked out part 1, make sure you do that. If you like the conversation so far, drop me a comment. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. And then tune in for part 3 coming up, where I talk through how Powell's appointment to the Supreme Court has largely been responsible for a lot of the judicial decisioning that you're seeing today and how that's had a direct impact on the civil rights movement. In parts 1 and 2 of this conversation, I covered how the Calais decision was one of many in a long line of decisions designed to consolidate power into the hands of the rich, white, wealthy, elite males of society. I also covered how one single document, the Powell memo, was what set the stage and established the playbook for the Republican Party to be able to execute what we're seeing today. That was the great-grandfather of Project 2025. But here's where it gets interesting. In this conversation, I'm going to talk through about how Lewis Powell, the author of the Powell document, did the most damage when he actually got his reins on the Supreme Court. And his rulings have single-handedly stripped power away from the average, everyday working American and handed it off to the billionaires, the millionaires, and their corporate overlords. And that's what we're going to cover in this conversation. So buckle up. And if you haven't already done so, make sure you subscribe, give me a follow. That way you'll never miss another episode of Left in Exile. Let's get into it. Now, it'd be one thing if all he did was write a memo, but he did a lot more than that, and it didn't stop at just writing that memo. A few months later, he ended up on the Supreme Court thanks to Tricky Dick Nixon, who, before today, was widely known as one of the most corrupt presidents in the history of the U.S. And here's what's interesting. He was nominated to the Supreme Court, but that memo never saw the light of day during his confirmation hearings. It was only after he was confirmed that it was leaked. And what was discovered was that it was a blueprint for big business to attack its critics. But that's par for the course. Republicans have been hiding their judicial nominees' positions on a wide array of issues throughout the confirmation process so that they could continue their efforts of taking over the courts. And once Powell was put into power, he put into play, through his decisions, the corporate counter-revolution. And he helped build the legal architecture that treats corporations like constitutional actors. If you want to understand why later court decisions deemed that corporations are like people, you need to look at the foundation that Lewis Powell put into place. His reasoning in Buckley versus Vallejo tied campaign spending to political speech. His decision in First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti gave corporations First Amendment rights to spend money on ballot initiatives. Now think about what that means. We right now talk about Citizens United as something that needs to be blown up, and it does. But Citizens United was built on the backs of Lewis Powell's decisions. And when we think about the implications of that decision, meant that while workers have to organize one break session at a time, corporations get constitutional megaphones to do the same thing, to bust up the unions. Workers end up getting busted unions, corporations get speech rights. Workers get told to shut up and be grateful, and corporations get treated like citizens. That's power choosing aside, all built on the foundation that Lewis Powell articulated before he got appointed to the Supreme Court. And when you take a look at those two decisions, that's when this Republican project starts to make sense. Because Republicans figured out something very important. You don't need to win every argument if you can capture the institutions. And those institutions can decide which arguments matter. You capture the courts, you capture the media ecosystem, you capture universities through donor pressure, you capture state legislatures through gerrymandering, you capture the administrative state by starving it and then claiming that it doesn't work, all at the same time handing off those same agencies and services to your private sector buddies that can funnel cash back into your campaigns. You capture public anger through race panic, gender panic, immigration panic, trans panic, crime panic, school panic. And while everybody is fighting each other, the donor class is picking your pockets clean. That's the trick. And that's what the billionaire class, the millionaire class, and the Republican mouthpieces and megaphones have been doing for the last 50 years. That's always been the trick. That's been the trick since before the founding of this country. Divide and conquer. It's been the plan. Get working people divided by identity, then make sure that they never notice who is actually stealing their wages, their time, their health care, housing, schools, voting rights, bodily autonomy. That is the Republican platform, and that is the Republican architecture and machine. It's a sorting system. The billionaires and corporations get rights, states gets rights, white backlash gets rights, workers get lectures, black voters get suspicions, immigrants get raids, women get surveillance, trans people get erased, and everybody else gets told this is individual liberty, limited government, personal responsibility in action. That's the mythology that they sell you, and that's the mythology that they use to distract you from what they're actually doing. So how does that connect with today? When you look at Louisiana versus Calais, that didn't happen in a vacuum. The court has been redefining racial discrimination for decades, and it hasn't been redefined as a material reality of discrimination. It hasn't been redefined as a system that denies people power. It hasn't been redefined as voting maps that dilute black voters. The court has redefined discrimination in a really strange way. It's redefined discrimination largely propelled by conservative thought that has been dominating the judicial majority. It's redefined discrimination as the act of noticing race at all, not the practice of discrimination, not denying people power, not cracking and packing congressional districts, but the simple fact that race is a consideration, that's discriminatory. And that's the insidious reasoning that the Republican Party has used and Republican courts have used that's brought us to today. And it's been a death by 10,000 paper cuts, and it's been a complete scam. They take law designed to stop racial discrimination, then use it to block remedies for racial discrimination, and throw in a little bit of magical thinking, making the statement that we need to be colorblind, because if we put in colorblind laws, of course, the white majority, and particularly the white majority of the Confederate-era South, are going to willingly dilute their power and make sure everybody has a chance of representation. That level of magical thinking is usually reserved for people that do a lot of illicit drugs. And yet we have Supreme Court justices making that sort of leap in logic in their decisioning. And what happens as a result? They take the Voting Rights Act, and every single year since the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act has been passed, the same states of the American Confederacy have been attacking both of those laws to try to dismantle it. And you have, since Nixon, the Republican Party leading the charge, the so-called defenders of civil rights, has been dismantling anything and everything that they can think of that dilutes the power of wealthy white elite men. And here's what's interesting, and here's how twisted their logic is. They take the Voting Rights Act, which was written to protect black voting power, and they twist it as a weapon against black voting power. That should be on a poster about how to maintain white supremacy, because that is what the court is doing. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act was amended by Congress after the courts tried to require proof of discriminatory purpose. Congress said no. The law should never cover discriminatory results, because everybody with a working brain understands that if a voting rule crushes black voting power, you shouldn't need to get a handwritten note saying, "Dear Diary, today I did the racism." But that's what the Roberts Court has been putting out, not just in this decision, but several other decisions as well. Now that you have a clear idea of how the Republican conversations about making America great again is actually a straight line that draws from not only the Revolution, but specifically the Civil War, Operation Paperclip, the Powell memo, and Lewis Powell's judicial decisions, those all set the stage for the reasoning that the Roberts Court has used over and over again when it comes to civil rights. Lewis Powell provided the framework and the playbook for the business class and the judicial class and their Republican allies to transform society into what we see today. But that transformation has been a decades-long process. Depending on how you're making the calculation, you're talking about a 50 to 70-year project of overturning everything that came out of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and now we enter the next phase of that process, taking us back to the era of the First Republic. And that's what we're going to cover in the next part in this series. If you've liked the conversation so far, make sure you drop me a subscribe, and definitely tune in for the next part where we cover how the Roberts Court is playing a strong role in reshaping society into the ideal vision of the wealthy white elites that control the business class and, more importantly, the Republican Party. How did the Roberts Court come up with the idea that we live in a post-racial society and everything that was established in the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act doesn't need to be applied any longer? Those are the questions that we're going to tackle in this conversation, which is part of a series that details how the Calais decision that recently passed and gutted the Voting Rights Act is actually just one in a long line of conservative and Republican efforts to return us back to an era where they say America was great. And that era where America was great was one where rich, white, wealthy men controlled everything, and the rest of us were just cannon fodder. In this conversation, we're going to cover the evolution of the courts and how the Republican takeover of the courts has led to what we see today in terms of judicial decisioning with respect to the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and what that actually means for us as everyday Americans. And if you haven't already done so, make sure you check out the previous episodes and drop me a follow and subscribe so that you don't miss any future episodes of Left in Exile. So when we look at the Roberts Court and the decisions that they've made, what were the foundations that they were built upon? If you want to answer those questions, that process started in the 80s working forward. The court narrowed Section 2 towards the pre-1982 standard, making intent the key issue again. So if you want to bring a civil rights claim, you have to prove intent and race-based intent in order to get heard. And that's how the game works now. They make it harder for you to prove discrimination, and they say that no discrimination exists. The civil rights era was a long time ago. We're in a post-racial society. Because one black guy got elected, we are now magically in a post-racial society, and none of this matters. This is them burying the body and demanding a missing persons report signed by the murderer. And when you dig into the details, Sam Alito's opinion is even worse than that. Alito gives Republican legislatures a roadmap for returning their states back to the Confederate era, Jim Crow era South, or worse. He says, just don't say race, say party. It's totally fine for you to gerrymander based on political and party considerations. Because if black voters tend to vote Democratic, Republican legislatures can claim that they were targeting Democrats, not black voters. And you can apply that down the line to every marginalized community that you see. That's the shell game. Race goes under one cup, party goes under another cup. The court moves the cups around and then tells black voters that they're imagining the whole thing. They're telling women that they're imagining the whole thing. They're telling gay people and trans people that they're imagining all of this. And why does that matter? Because when you look at the Common Cause case, that court already said that they're not going to police partisan gerrymandering. So now you have a 1-2 punch. Between the Calais case and the Common Cause case, you have the playbook for the Neo-Confederacy, the Republican Party, to execute gerrymandering at will and institute permanent white male majority rule. What this is racial discrimination that's being laundered. It's being laundered as partisan gerrymandering, and then the court has created the permission slip in the playbook for Republican-controlled states to destroy minority voting power and call it politics. That's how you usher in a white Christian nationalist ethno-state. That is the design. That's minority rule with a lifetime appointment stapled to the front. And the irony of all of this is that the constitutional interpretation that the Roberts Court would like to have you believe is that discrimination on the basis of race is permitted, but fixing discrimination on the basis of race is not. This is the typical type of convoluted gaslighting logic that you expect from MAGA. But then again, this is a court that is a MAGA court. And it's no surprise that MAGA draws its tagline from the KKK, and it's no surprise that this court is using the same reasoning and logic that the states that founded the KKK adhered to when they exterminated black people at will and chased them away from the polls. This has been the goal of the conservative project since the passage of the Civil War amendments. And what this means is that it's bringing to the forefront the underlying principles that's driven the Republican Party since the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. The Neo-Confederacy, the Republican Party, has been making the argument that the Reconstruction amendments themselves are illegitimate.
Gives us a chance in all of them if we give some reprieve to the courts, and so we'll see how that goes, and certainly hope that the Supreme Court will overturn Amendment 14 and gives us a shot to revisit those.
So what would you say from your perspective? I mean, other than Mr. Pro Tem, everyone was relatively silent on the goings-on. So what would you say, from your perspective, is the biggest misconception about what the bills do, and a message that you'd like to see out there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the biggest misconception is, the thing about it is, people tend to forget what happened when this thing went to court before. We actually, the Republican Party had that seat in, I guess, in Mobile. Number 2 seat, that's congressional seat 2, so the district 2, and so that was one of the things. There's been a push through the courts to try to overtake some of these red state seats, and that's certainly what happened in that one. And with the ruling that happened in Louisiana, we felt like it gave us a chance to maybe regain that seat, but also open up District 7. So I think that's happened. All we need now is the courts to overturn 14, and we can look at a new election.
And when you look at how conservatives attacked those amendments and later amendments, conservatives were the ones that attacked Brown versus Board of Education. Conservatives are the ones that are attacking the Voting Rights Act. They're the ones who have been making the case that the Reconstruction era amendments and everything after that has been a betrayal of originalist constitutional principles. That's the through line that you need to understand. These conservatives, these neo-Confederates of today, they don't want the Constitution that came after the Civil War. They want the Constitution that occurred before the Civil War. The one where rights are narrow, citizenship is narrow, voting is narrow, power is narrow, and white men ran the place. So when you hear originalism, understand what the meaning is. What originalism means from their perspective is that the courts exist and the Constitution exists to insulate white power. And when you understand that that's the goal, you also understand who isn't included in that calculation. Black people aren't, women aren't, indigenous people aren't, workers aren't. None of those people deserve political power. That's the architecture. You're choosing a starting point. You're choosing a jurisprudence where most of the country was excluded. And when you understand all of this, you understand that the legal reasoning that the court is applying today is the same legal reasoning that existed in the antebellum era before the Reconstruction amendments. That era didn't guarantee equal protection. It didn't protect voting rights. It didn't outlaw discrimination. It protected the rights of some men to own other men as property. That is the worldview that today's Republican Party wants to return to. And they won't say any of these things outright. They won't say slavery. They'll say states' rights. They won't say Jim Crow. They'll say election integrity. They won't say white rule. They'll say colorblindness. They won't say corporate oligarchy. They'll say free enterprise. And all of that points to the same era and the same type of society. It points to an era in society where there are a small number of dominators and the rest of us are dominated. And that's where the Powell memo connects to the Roberts Court. Powell's memo said business needed to organize across education, media, politics, and law. Powell's business cases notes that the business roundtable that formed in 1972 followed right-wing foundations and think tanks and legal groups. The Federalist Society, Cato, Heritage Foundation, Pacific Legal Foundation, Chambers National Litigation Center. All of those came after the Powell memo. That's the machine that got us to here today. That was the infrastructure. It wasn't one bad judge, one bad election. It wasn't one bad president. It was a 50-year project, an institutional siege, and the Republican Party became the political vehicle for that siege. They used corporate money to build the courts. They used courts to protect corporate money. They used corporate money to build the media. They used the media to radicalize and racialize voters. They used radicalized voters to win state power. They used state power to suppress votes. Then they suppress votes to hold federal power. And then they used federal power to stack the court. And the court turned around and called the whole thing constitutional. That's the racket that they ran. And we are stuck right in the middle of it. And when you look at how we got stuck, that's where identity and culture wars comes in. Because the culture war isn't a distraction from the economic project. It's the fuel source. See, Powell saw civil rights, consumer protection, students, media, and social reformers as threats to corporate power. Modern Republicans took that fear and turned it into a mass politics of resentment. They tell white workers that black voters are stealing power. They tell men that women are stealing jobs. They tell straight people that the LGBTQIA plus community are stealing culture. They tell Christians that pluralism is persecution. They tell citizens that immigrants are stealing the country. And while everybody is angry at everybody else, the billionaire class walks out the door with the treasury. That is by design. It's not an accident. That's how this hierarchy survives. In a country where the majority would benefit from solidarity, you break everybody up into tiny little pieces and get them mad at each other so that you can rob them blind. That is what Powell set in motion. That is what Republicans enable, all to the benefit of the billionaire and millionaire class. You make workers hate each other. You make poor white people think that their boss is their friend and their black neighbor is the threat. You make men think feminism caused their problems, not wage theft, not union busting, not healthcare costs, not housing costs and corporate greed. You make people terrified of being replaced, then replace their wages with debt, their schools with propaganda, and their votes with gerrymanders. That's the Republican game. And it's been that game since the Reconstruction era, and the new foundation was put into place the day that the Voting Rights Act passed and Nixon thought up the Southern strategy. And conservatives have been fighting against Reconstruction and the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act every step of the way. After Reconstruction, it was conservatives that helped pave the way for Jim Crow. What conservatives did is that they gave the rights that were meant for the emancipated to corporations instead. It allowed states to disenfranchise black voters through supposed colorblind means. It permitted racial discrimination by government and private actors. And that was the first version of their trick. They took rights won through black struggle and then handed them to corporations. Then they tell black people the Constitution has nothing left for them. And now we're watching the second iteration of that. The Roberts Court has been on a decade-long jihad against voting rights, and particularly black voting rights. Corporate power continues to expand while individuals are living paycheck to paycheck in an era of record profits. Republican legislatures draw maps where voters can't remove them, and then the same party that screams about freedom while building a system where fewer and fewer people have actual power over their own lives. Freedom for the Republican Party means domination, and domination is the song that the billionaire class wants to sing because they don't see us as people. They see us as fuel that's designed to be spent and disposed of. Freedom never means anything for the workers. Freedom for workers, negotiate with your landlord. Freedom for women, bleed out in the parking lot. Freedom for black voters, sue after the election is stolen. Freedom for immigrants, carry papers and hope the masked agents believe you, or roll dice and see if you make it out of the gulags that they've been constructing since they gained power. Freedom for corporations, though, spend unlimited money and call it speech. That's the Constitution of the Republican Party. That's the Constitution of the billionaire class and the millionaire class. That is the republic. That is the first republic that they want. So when they tell you a republic and a democracy are two different things, in their minds, it is. And that's how it's architected. So if you're sitting here thinking that this is an attack on everything that we see out there, it is an attack on everything. Why do you think they're going after birthright citizenship? Because the birthright citizenship was written into the 14th Amendment to overturn Dred Scott's conclusion that black people could never be citizens. When I say they want to return back to the First Republic, they want to return back to an era where people could own people. And guess what sort of people can get owned? So when Trump is attacking birthright citizenship, it's not a side issue. All of his handlers are wanting this enacted. That's a direct attack on one of the core achievements of Reconstruction, and the billionaire class wants to see to it that those who have the gold are free to dispose of anyone who doesn't and use them as they see fit. That's the attack on the idea that citizenship is not a racial inheritance. The reason why billionaires want this to happen is because they want to do away with the idea that the state can't create a hereditary underclass inside the United States. The billionaire capitalist wet dream dictates that you need a permanent underclass to exploit. That's why they're going hard at this. That's why they want that old order back, because they cannot survive without that permanent underclass. All of the billionaire parasites and their dark enlightenment talk is all about returning to a country where some people have rights and some people have conditional rights and some people have status as never having status. That is the logic of the First Republic that filters through Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, Mark Zuckerberg, and every other billionaire parasite that you see today. They see themselves as the masters, and they see the rest of us as property. So don't miss the outcome of all of this. They want to restrict black freedom because it allows for the same things that happened when black freedom was revoked after Reconstruction. It doesn't create prosperity except for the billionaire class. Because what happened when black freedom was squashed in the post-Reconstruction era, it created the Gilded Age, a society where the upper classes gained massive wealth. Economic crises devastated millions of people. Workers were divided by race and class so that they couldn't challenge the rich. And that's the part that all of us need to understand. The billionaire class and white supremacy aren't just morally evil. What they're doing is not just moral evil. It's the economy weaponized against the citizenry to break the will of everybody else so that they accept the bare minimum as long as someone else is lower. It convinces people to accept bad schools as long as someone else is blamed. It convinces people to accept no healthcare, no stability, no bargain power, no future, as long as they get the psychological wage of being above someone else. That's the con. That's how the billionaire and millionaire class stay where they are, and the rest of us live paycheck to paycheck because we are spending all of our time pointing the finger at somebody else who is the reason for why we are where we are, instead of going after these billionaire parasites and making sure that they no longer get a moment's peace. And this is what the Republicans have perfected. So when you see what the Roberts Court did in gutting the Voting Rights Act, this isn't just about voting. This is a gateway. If they can take away the vote of black people, they can do that to everyone else, and they can do that to everything else. They can confiscate your wages, your schools, your water, your roads, your healthcare, your bodily autonomy, your workplace protections, and your ability to live without state violence. Isn't it interesting how you see all of these billionaires pushing their data centers into all sorts of communities that are going to basically make those communities unlivable? And there's no protection for the people, but there's protection for the billionaire class and their data centers. That's why they're attacking the vote. And even as far back as 1865, Frederick Douglass understood this. He understood that without access to the ballot as a means of self-defense, liberty doesn't exist for the rest of us. It only exists for the billionaire class. That's why they're attacking the vote, because democracy is the tool, the one tool that the ordinary person can use to put a leash on power. And Republicans and their billionaire overlords don't want a leash. They want power to be unleashed. They want power to be unleashed on workers, on black voters, on immigrants, on women, on queer and trans people, on anyone that's not aligned with their racial, religious, or corporate order. And this is where we need to be clear. This is not a return to the past because Republicans love history. Honestly, most Republicans can't even read. This is a return to the past because the past gives them a model before Reconstruction where rights were narrow, before labor law, bosses had near total control, before civil rights, states could enforce a white nationalist ethno-state, before the modern regulatory state, corporations could poison, exploit, discriminate, and call it business. Before the Voting Rights Act, white political machines could suppress black votes and still call themselves democratic. That's the world that they want updated. They want that same hierarchy with better technology, more surveillance, more money, more courts, more propaganda, and more excuses. That's what they mean when they say, take our country back. And that's why they can never answer the questions when you ask them. Take the country back from who? Take the country back to when? Take the country back to what? And the reason why they don't answer those questions is because the answers to those questions all point to the same ugly crap that they want to hide from you. They want to take it back before Reconstruction, back before civil rights, back before workers had power, back before women had autonomy, back before the federal government could enforce equal citizenship, back to that first republic, back to the owner's republic, back to the slaveholder's imagination with a corporate logo on top of it. So what do we do from here? What can we do from here? The first thing that we need to do is understand that the Calais decision, when it comes to the redistricting in Louisiana, is not the end of this. The ultimate goal for the Republican Party is to return back to the first republic. And what that means for every Democrat going forward is that they need to be principled and disciplined in stating that there is going to be broad legislative and regulatory and business reforms and punishment and accountability for everyone involved in this exercise of returning us back to the era of slave masters and slaves. We need a new Voting Rights Act. And one of the first things that the new Voting Rights Act needs to do is expand the number of people that can be elected into the House. The current construction of the House of Representatives hasn't changed since the early 1900s. We're in 2026. We're long past the era and the population where we need a whole lot of new House districts. And when that law gets passed, we need to make sure that baked into that law is the fact that the courts cannot review the law. And when we're talking about the courts, we need to expand the courts at all levels. And we need to establish term limits for Supreme Court justices. Those term limits need to be no more than 18 years. So now this sort of judicial capture can never happen again. We need to make sure that there's laws in place that dictate that felons and criminals cannot get elected into any elected office, from the local level all the way up to the presidency. We need to make sure that anyone that is running for office, that a law is on the books that says that unless you have complete financial disclosure, you are ineligible to run. We need to get rid of Citizens United. We need to bring in a 95% top marginal tax rate. And that means anybody with wealth and a net worth over $20 million gets taxed at 95% for every dollar over that $20 million. We need to make sure that the corporate tax rates are upwards of 50%. We need to disappear the days where corporations can make billions in profits and give their executive teams multi-million dollar bonuses while their workers are scraping along with 2-3 jobs barely at minimum wage. We need to understand that when Republicans talk about deregulation, what they're really saying is we want the referees out of the game so we can run every scam that we can think of. Because the bottom line of all of this, and that's not a comprehensive list of things that need to be done. That's just what's top of mind. The bottom line of all of this is not that the court is corrupt. It's not that the Republican Party is authoritarian. It's not that corporate America funded a 50-year legal counter-revolution. The takeaway of all of this is that just because rights exist on paper, those words on paper don't defend themselves. They never have. They require knuckles to get dirty and bloody, and for the people to punch back and demand that their rights be upheld. The Civil War amendments didn't enforce themselves. The Voting Rights Act didn't pass itself. And all of those things are under attack because of voter apathy and the right-wing media ecosystem convincing you that there is no difference between one party or another. Meanwhile, there is definitely one party that's taking the rights away of all the people in this country, except for the rich, white, wealthy elites. What we need to understand is that every right that we have beyond the Bill of Rights was paid for in blood. Labor rights didn't appear because bosses woke up and decided, hey, I'll be a nice guy today. Every inch of what we have today was forced into existence by people who understood that power never gives anything away voluntarily. You have to take it. So whatever action items we come up with, they need to start with the reality that no amount of protests and marches are going to make the wealthy white elite hand over the reins of power. There are no magical courts. There are no savior politicians. There's no fantasy of shame that's going to get these people to do what they need to do, because these people have no shame. What this means is that we need relentless organization, relentless pressure, relentless solidarity, and a willingness to do what is necessary to force these people in power to pay attention and back down or pay and suffer the ultimate consequences. We're already seeing the consequences of Calais come into play. All of the states of the former Confederacy are moving rapidly to redistrict. Louisiana, for example, is stopping their primary elections so they can redraw the maps and consolidate white power. And you see this all across the South. The region of the country that has more black people in it than any other region of the country, those Republican-controlled neo-Confederate states are racing to put back in Jim Crow-era laws. That's what Republicans are doing. They're already coming after birthright citizenship. Watch what the court does with the 14th and 15th Amendment. Watch how colorblindness keeps getting used to protect discrimination and punish remedies. And watch the money. Always watch the money, because behind every one of these moral panics, there's usually a donor looking for a tax cut or a deregulation win or a union busting opportunity in the face of a workforce that's too divided to fight back. What we need to understand is that the First Republic was never built for all of us. Reconstruction was the attempt to break it. The Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act was the first attempt to finish the job. But the Republican Party and conservatives never gave up the fight to bring us back to the First Republic. So when they tell you their mythology about they're the party of freedom, understand what they mean. It's freedom for them. It's freedom for the rich, white, wealthy elites. And everyone else's role is to obey. That's the project. That's their fight. And we need to understand it really quickly. And we need to understand that no amount of protest is going to make them understand. We need to recognize that in order to stem the tide and push back, it's going to require us to push back, punch back, and fight back. Thanks for checking out this series on the impact of how the Calais decision was actually set in motion through decades of Republican and conservative capture of media, the courts, and all of the major institutions that we see in day-to-day life. Hope you enjoyed the discussion. Let me know what you think of it in the comments. If you haven't already done so, make sure you subscribe to the show, and that way you'll never miss an episode. Stay tuned for more in the coming weeks.